Okay, let's look at the last section from this chapter. To me, this is the most problematic section. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at gender and language. And the idea is that by the end of this chapter, you could describe the influence that gender has on language. So, that as the textbook says, so far we have discussed language usage as if it were identical for women and men. Are there differences between male and female language use? If so, how important are they? And I mean, as you can tell from reading this chapter, there are huge differences in how the experts see this. And it's interesting, most of the time when I ask people about it, they tend to come down on the side of approach number one, that there are significant differences. And there was a man by the name of John Gray who about 20 years ago wrote a book which was a bestseller called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And the idea being that it's a wonder that men and women can communicate with each other because they actually basically speak two different languages. Okay. His work was not a scholarly work. It was just based on, conversations he had with people. It's not research that's been, that they did the statistical analysis and to see if these, the results are replicated. So this is more the popular, it was in the popular press. However, there are scholars who contend that the behaviors between men and women actually create two different cultures because men and women are socialized differently. Deborah Tannen is a big name in, the differences between how men speak and how women speak. And she says basically, in her studies, she's noticed that men have a tendency to have a task-oriented style. So they're reporting, whereas women have a more relationship-oriented style. So they're building rapport. So she's got report versus rapport. Haha, really cute. I mean, the textbook goes through, social scientist after social scientist who has done some research and said that there are significant differences. To me, what was the most interesting was that they found when they looked at how people communicated via the written word online, mostly in Facebook. So, how valid is this? Okay, found very strong differences between how men used men used language and women used language. That women used more emotion words, they used the word I more, they made more references to people in their lives. Men made references more to objects and swore more often. Okay, so I don't know. I mean, one person calls it, Julia Wood refers to this as gendered socialization. That the idea is when women are girls, they tend to play house where there are no rules necessarily, and there's a lot of pro-social cooperation. And so that's what they learn when they're younger, and that's what they gravitate towards when they're older. Whereas for the most part, boys will play things like football or baseball or soccer, which has a larger group and has actually very specific roles that people play, and the goal is competitive. So verbal communication is not as important. Okay, there's some interesting information. If you look at the focus on research on page 175, it talks about how men and women communicate in Wikipedia when they are either administrators, or editors, and what they see as a difference between both how men and women communicate and how people communicate based on their role in the organization. I mean, this is serious stuff, but I've included in the videos that what do they call it? Videos that are referred to in the textbook and the lectures. There's a very funny, I think it's funny, video called "The Man's Later," and so watch it and see if you think it's true. Okay, the other side, approach number 2, says there are minor differences, and it's more like men are from North Dakota and women are from South Dakota. So they've done some they've done some meta-analysis, which means in one case they looked at different studies and they pulled them all together. So they're looking at 3,000 participants and said that women were only slightly more likely to use tentative speech. And what they've found is that there don't seem to be differences in talkativeness. You know, the women talk more than men. They're not finding that when they do these meta-analyses. That there's not a big difference in affiliative language, the words we use to form a connection with other people. And there's not a big difference in how assertive people are in speech. Okay. I thought this last one was the most interesting, that they had somebody transcribe what people said, and then they gave these transcriptions to people who had no idea what was going on, and they said, is this a man or a woman speaking? Or is this a man, a woman, or someone who's transgendered? And people don't know. You know, they'll say, oh, well, this is a man. And they're no better than a chance at figuring out the gender of the person speaking. So I'm just curious, what do you think? Are men's and women's language more similar, or do you see a lot of differences? Maybe the difference has to do with factors other than gender. So really there are 4 factors that can be stronger than gender. And one of them is topic. And they said when women were in a mixed group and they were talking about sports and cars and topics that are generally seen as more masculine, the women used more tentative speech. And when men were in a conversation, mixed conversation, and they talked about subjects considered feminine, such as shopping, men were more tentative. So basically what this is saying is if we are not comfortable with a topic, we're not going to come across as if we know what we're talking about. Okay, that makes sense. Setting also has an impact. So what they find is when you listen to people talking, when you listen to, let's say, parents talking at home, there's not a big difference between who males and females, or if people are in the workplace. I know the textbook talked about when they paid attention to how men who worked in like a daycare center or nursery school, how they spoke. They said this, basically they don't see any difference between how the men spoke and how the women spoke. So that the idea of the occupation seems to outweigh, what they were speaking, the way a daycare provider would speak, a doctor would speak, an engineer would speak. That seems to be a stronger indicator of how people are going to speak. Another one has to do with power. So you look at, I think that also, if you look at the focus on research on page 175, who has the power in the organization and how do these people speak? How do these people write? Let's see. Findings suggest characteristics characteristically feminine or masculine speech has been less a function of gender or sex than context or social power historically. In fact, differences in social status often show up more clearly in language than gender differences do. So that's, to me, that's the bottom line. But I do not pretend that I am an expert on this. I'm just going on my observations and my experience with the world. So, what do you think? How do you think that gender influences the language that we use based on not just what you read in the textbook, but your own experiences? And how have you seen factors other than gender influence the language that is used in interpersonal relationships? All right, so that is chapter 6, all about language. I hope you found it interesting, even if you didn't think it's as interesting as I think it is. And we will talk about this on Monday for those of you who can